Welcome to a brand new 12-week series of Rich Planet TV. I'm Richard D. Hall. Rich Planet TV is a fully independent show which does not accept as truth most of the unevidenced reporting in mainstream media and attempts to get past their perception management strategies in order to get closer to the truth about what is going on this planet. If you're not interested in the truth, then please switch channels now. One thing I will point out before we get the show underway is that Rich Planet has produced over 200 hours of films and TV shows, all available to watch online from richplanet.net. Some of this material has not been allowed on television, even though it is evidence-based. Find in-depth films about the Cumbria shootings and the Madeleine McCann story and many other issues from the links on the screen. This week's guest is the author of the blog website The Truth Seeker's Guide. For over 5 years, he has discussed subjects like mind control, ufology, false flag events, social engineering, psychological warfare, health, energy, and consciousness. Recently, he has specialized in esoteric and occult symbolism in the output of the mainstream media. In 2013, he published his first book, Science Fiction and the Hidden Global Agenda, which examines the connections between famous science fiction writers, directors and producers and the machinations of the global elite. He has given a number of talks at alternative knowledge venues in the UK. Welcome, Carl James.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
All right then, Carl. Now, we're going to talk today about Stanley Kubrick and your research into his work. Now, I covered the issue of the moon landings with Andrew Johnson in two previous TV shows. If you want to look those up, that's show number 145 and 146. And Andrew presented a great deal of evidence which casts massive doubt over whether the moon landings were as reported. Let's just put it that way. Now, in those interviews, we mentioned Stanley Kubrick and his front projection system, which he developed in the 1960s, which some say was used as the sets for the moon landings. But before we get into that, just give us some background on Stanley Kubrick and who was Stanley Kubrick.
He was a very eccentric character. He was a bit sort of anal in the way he made his films. I think he only ever made sort of 13 sort of big films. I think he did a couple of documentaries and sort of low budget films beforehand, but because he was so meticulous about the way he made his films, it took him years between films. So everything in his films was put where it was for a specific reason. He drove the cast and crew bonkers with sort of repetitive shots and things like that. So he really was, everything that's in his films that I would argue is there for a reason. It indicates something. And he was also a very well-connected man as well. He had a lot of what I would call establishment connections, people high up and...
Right. Now, so what you're saying is he was so pedantic that, let's say there's just an ornament or something on a set, it's going to have a reason for being there.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah.
And you've looked at a vast amount of information.
Yeah, there's plenty of evidence of that, yeah.
All right. Because people might say, well, why are you bothering to look at this? What's the point? Why are you looking into his background? If it is a lie, the moon landings, if they were faked, as a lot of people now believe, it's a massive lie. As Bart Zabrell said, it's a satanic lie. And it needs to be exposed. So looking into the background of Kubrick is important. Now you've split your research up into 3 areas. I'll just tell the viewers what they are, and then we'll go down into each one. There's the connections that Kubrick had with certain key people who were linked to NASA and other organisations. The clues in the films themselves, as we've just
predominantly
mentioned.
The Shining is the main film, but there are clues in other films as well.
And also other films that have been produced which put forward the case that Kubrick was involved, but do it in a really bad way to make people think that no, he wasn't really involved. Kind of a limited hangout. So what connections did he have?
First of all, I wanted to sort of quote from this article that it's called Dr. Strangelove, a strange and terrible glimpse into the deep state. I don't know the name of the author, but it really sums up Kubrick, sort of where he is. Basically, the author says Kubrick seems to have been aligned, probably very loosely, with what I like to refer to as the Anglo-American establishment, when typical conspiracy theorists rail against the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the international bankers, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds and so forth. This is essentially who they're referring to. But this is not the only power elite within the international community or even the United States itself. One of the most compelling aspects of Dr. Strangelove is its nuanced view of the American power structure and the confirmation it gives of a divide within the structure of the organisations. So certainly if you look at Dr. Strangelove, which is a real condemnation of the military-industrial complex, you can sort of see that he's allied sort of to a group that opposes that sort of...
So Dr. Strangelove was a 1960s film which preceded
early 60s,
his 2001
That's
film.
right, yeah.
And just give us a brief outline of what it was about.
Basically, it's just showing the ineptitude of the people in power, and it instigates that they instigate a nuclear war, basically, and the end of the world, and the total incompetence of everybody involved, the Russians, the Americans, and no one has a clue what anybody's doing, and who holds the keys, basically, to setting up the bombs and that, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Did Kubrick then actually make certain connections with high up people in the making of that film then?
He did, yes, yeah. I mean, one of his consultants was this chap called Alistair Francis Buchanan, who's the director of International Institute for Strategic Studies, which is effectively connected to the Round Table Group, Kissinger, the Rothschilds, that sort of thing. And he actually pointed Kubrick to the film's the source of the inspiration for the film, which was Peter George's novel Red Alert. Peter George was also known as Peter Bryant, and he was a British intelligence officer as well. So,
right.
Also a couple of other things. Sterling Hayden, who played Brigadier General Jack Ripper in the film, had an extensive career in the OSS, which is the precursor to the CIA as well. So, there's a few connections there, even at that point. So,
right. And then we come on to 2001, The Space Odyssey. So I understand that Kubrick consulted people at NASA for this particular. So what would the reason for that be then?
It's basically been put across that he wanted it to be as accurate as possible. He wanted it to sort of reflect what was going on with NASA at that time. He wanted it to be sort of an extension of the technology that NASA was allegedly creating at that point. So, so he brought on a lot of people involved with NASA. Clark himself was heavily involved with NASA. He had high connections in NASA, but he had these two principal scientific advisors on the film, Frederick Ira Ordway III and Harry Langer. Ordway was a former member of the American Rocket Society, space scientist, and author of technical books about spaceflight. He worked with ballistic rockets until 1960, followed by 3 years at Marshall Space Flight Center. So he was, you know, and Langer was an illustrator and designer for the aerospace industry, head of NASA's Future Projects section, worked with Wernher von Braun on nuclear propulsion ideas like that, space platforms. So they're well connected chaps.
All right, and Bertrand Russell?
Yeah. I mean, actually, there's a number of people that.
Who's not so much a technical person, more of a...
there was this group of people that sort of hangers-on consultants for him, and he'd approached them on all kinds of subjects. He was talking about the possibility of AI intelligence because of the Hal character in the film and that. So, and Bertrand Russell, having been involved with the Fabian Society and the Round Table organisation, connections to Tavistock methodology and all that. A couple of other people, Margaret Mead, B.F. Skinner as well, he consulted them. Very, very well connected in that sort of area. Tavistock methodology, that sort of thing. Margaret Mead herself, her husband, Gregory Bateson, was Director of Research at the Veterans Hospital, Palo Alto, involved with MK Ultra mind control research as well. So, you know, she was also involved with this group called the World Federation of Mental Health, which is probably quite well known. And the president of that was Dr. John Rawlings Rees of the Tavistock Clinic and British Psychological Warfare Bureau as well. So,
right. And the film set was visited by senior Apollo administrator George Mueller.
Mueller, yeah.
George Mueller, and an astronaut.
Yeah, Deke Slayton, yeah.
And the documentation of the visit was classified secret at the time.
It was, yeah, which is very peculiar. I don't know exactly when it was classified and when it was declassified, and it looks as though it was available from about 1975 onwards. It was certainly available from about 1996. Yeah, so there's this photograph of Deke Slayton, George Mueller, Fred Ordway, Clark and Kubrick walking across the lot. And apparently George Mueller said that he called the place NASA East, based on all the technical equipment that was there and the paperwork, documentation, all that. But that photograph and some of the paperwork associated with it was classified with this memo dated June 4th, 1965, for the attention of Eric Goldman, special consultant for Lyndon Johnson. And basically in the document they're talking about Kubrick being this profoundly influential film director. And they were considering him for involvement in this film festival that was going to go on at the White House. So
right.
It was a very politically orientated thing. I don't know whether he actually did attend. Production was quite, you know, by 64 the production of 2001 A Space Odyssey was already up and running.
Right.
I think it was released in 68, so it's a good sort of 4 or 5 years that it was going
so
on.
over a number of years, over sort of a 4-year period then,
Yeah.
Kubrick's got all these connections within NASA, and he's in, the set is called, what did you
NASA
say?
East.
NASA East. And then in 69 we had the alleged moon landings.
Yes.
So you've created quite a good case there for that he was clearly very well connected.
Yeah, I mean,
with NASA and all.
Yeah, I mean, can I just say as well that in terms of the companies that were actually involved with it, I'll just quickly read out what Frederick Ordway actually said about it. Yeah, Frederick Ordway basically said, we relied heavily on advice from NASA. A considerable number of private companies, found myself visiting General Electric, Missile and Space Vehicle Department, the Bell Telephone Laboratories, Whirlpool Corporation, Honeywell, which I think now is associated with JPL and NASA, IBM as well, and those cooperative arrangements were began in New York and then they were carried over to the production in England as well. So it's a lot of companies heavily involved with the production of it.
All right, and Carl, well, we're going to go to the first break, and after the break we're going to talk about some of the clues in Kubrick's films.